final video of this short section, we're going to bring the demand curve, which we've already built here, and remember it's reflecting your marginal benefit, and the supply curve, which is reflecting the marginal cost to firms of producing things as they use up these scarce factors of production. And this is a typical market where demand curve is downward sloping with respect to price, supply curve is upward sloping, and so we have a point here which we call the market clearing price, and this is the best definition of equilibrium, to be honest, but there's others, so you can use all three. And what that means is that, whatever is brought to the market by the firms is cleared from the shelves, as it were, because you've hit the right price, and 200 is demanded by consumers and 200 has been supplied by the firms on their supply curve, and so the market is clearing at a price of £15. Whatever is demanded, if I was demanding 200, then that encourages firms to produce me my 200 goods. So that is what we know as equilibrium. It's also known as market clearing. And we always bring in, I always bring in anyway, a little dot here, E, equilibrium, and E0, E1, E2, because in the next couple of videos we're going to be moving these curves, and it's important to know and identify where the new equilibrium points are. So an equilibrium price will clear the market. That's one thing you need to say. You can gain marks by saying it's where demand equals supply. That to me is a little bit basic, but that's fine. And also there's no tendency to change. In other words, if the demand curve doesn't shift and the supply curve doesn't shift, nothing is going to move the price away from the £15 mark. So this equilibrium is the starting point of a lot of your analysis. Now let's go a little bit deeper into this, because down here I put in here quantity demanded and supplied. I hope you can see that down there. So when you bring the supply and the demand curve together, you really ought to be labeling this axis here demand and supply. If you only had a demand curve, you put demand. If you only had a supply curve, you put supply. But really a demand or a supply on its own is a very limited use anyway. To save you writing that out completely, you can put the quantity that is traded in the market, or just quantity traded here, or Q, D and S if you want to. Okay, now if we remember, and this is a little bit advanced at this stage, but I thought it's worth having a little think about it, we had this consumer surplus idea where the consumer is willing to pay up here. Remember, this is effective demand, so they're willing and able to pay up here, and they only have to pay here, so they get a surplus. And that's called this consumer surplus, and it's that triangle there between the demand curve and the equilibrium price. The producer, on the other hand, is getting this in the market because the consumer's paid 15 quid, and it could, and it was willing and able to have supplied down here. So therefore, we have this area here called the producer surplus. Now, together as areas, these are really important because hopefully what you can see is that when we've reached equilibrium, when we've got to 200, by charging a price of 15, we've really got the most surplus that we can actually get, and the most surplus of producer and the consumer that we can get in this marketplace. In other words, if I'd stopped here, let's say, I put a restriction on as a government and said, you can only produce 150, we'd be saying, well, we wanted to get up to here, but we've only produced here, and we're cutting off, we're losing this bit of surplus here and this bit of surplus here. And surpluses are important, okay? So let me explain what that means. And as I say, do remember that the surplus and the surplus is maximized, but as output rises in this range, going from 0 to the 200, the marginal benefit that the consumers are gaining from their consumption is bigger than the marginal cost of the firms are producing it. Now, if you remember the whole problem of scarcity and the problem that brings, that there's a scarce number of factors of production and unlimited wants, then This is the consumer saying, I value the output up here. I'm willing to pay, I don't know, let's say £20 for it. And the firm is saying, well, it's only costing me, let's say, £8 in terms of using up those scarce factors of production. And so therefore, when we ask ourselves, should we have produced this amount here, this quantity here, the answer is yes, because the consumers are putting a higher value than the cost of using up the scarce factors of production, which is linked to the marginal cost of supply. And so as we move along here, as we move along the market, down the demand curve, up the supply curve, at every one of these outputs, this market is doing really well because it's adding more benefit than it is adding to the costs of production, i.e. the benefit to consumers is higher than the costs of using up those scarce factors of production. So this is a point here which is known as an allocatively efficient point. You have allocated factors of production right up to making 200 of these goods, and all of those factors of production are costing us something, but the consumer is gaining a higher benefit from you producing it than the cost of using up the scarce factors. And we'll come back to that. The efficiencies are really important in economics because it's one of the best ways that you can evaluate different things that are going on in a market. But just for now, a quick introduction to allocative efficiency. Okay, the argument is, I'll just go one more step, if we produced more, if the government said we must produce up here 220, then the cost of using up the scarce factors is higher than the benefit that the consumers get from doing so. So that's not a very good allocation of factors into this market. So hopefully that gives you a good idea about what do you mean by equilibrium. As I say, demand equals supply, market clearing price, no tendency to change. And in the next videos, we're going to start to change the equilibrium and say what happens if demand moves or supply moves.